Good morning, everybody. This is transmission episode 27, Capitalism, or as I wanted to call it, capitalism, more like crapitalism. Am I right? But I don't think Dan thinks that's professional enough. I don't know. I'm Mark Van Steenwick.
I thought it was a great idea.
I just wanted you to be my foil for my jokes.
There you go. Okay.
So I'm Mark Van Steenwick, the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
Yeah, and I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And yeah, we really appreciate everybody that watches and shows up. And I realized, and especially today, since we're talking about capitalism, seems like perfect timing. We've gone 27 episodes and we haven't talked about money. So MICA is sponsoring this, and doesn't cost a ton, but it costs for our time. And so if any of you are so inclined and have appreciated this, you could go to the MICA website, which is up there, micapraise.org, and there's a donate button, and you could give us some money.
How can you talk about capitalism as a bad thing when you're asking people for money, Dan?
I know. And we're on this groovy, innovative StreamYard program that was allowed to be produced by the innovation of capitalism.
And you hate capitalism? It looks like you're using a computer. Gotcha.
Okay, well, we're toast. That's the end of the episode, I guess.
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously we're not going to be able to explain or explore the many facets of capitalism within this now like 28 minutes we have left. But we wanted to talk about this because, we've talked about it from day one. We mentioned the term capitalism. Like I talk about capitalism all the time, but we don't know exactly. We don't always have the same thing in our minds when we say that word. And it's a big, murky term to use. And it doesn't make sense for us to really go in any depth in these other areas unless we take a pause and just at least talk about what capitalism is and how it relates to all these things we've been talking about. At least so we can have like a similar frame of reference and start getting at like, most of us don't really grow up knowing what capitalism is because it's our system. It's like it's our water. That's why fish, you try to explain water to a fish, they don't understand it. That's how it is trying to explain capitalism to people sometimes these days.
I thought it was just because fish had really tiny brains.
That's mean.
They're bigger than fly brains, right? I was studying fly brains. Their fish brains
That's
are
true.
bigger.
Yeah, they're geniuses.
They're geniuses. They could rule over. They could be the lord of the flies. The fish.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is really helpful to get in all of this is that when we hear a term like capitalism, and Mark was talking about earlier about the fact that this actually forms us, right? And we've talked about formation quite a bit. Is that we have all these very succinct little images of these giant systems in our lives. And one of the other examples that I was giving, which we could have talked about when we're talking about the food chain, is like farms. So, when you buy a Land O'Lakes butter thing, you see the land, and that's a butter company here in the Midwest. They have a logo, and the logo is this really pretty little bucolic farm, right? And they're the happy cows and the happy farmers, and it's one family, and it's probably like 20 acres, and everybody's like, oh, that's so awesome, right? Of course, this is nothing what a dairy farm looks like these days, but it's very important to portray that image, right? So we have a similar image for capitalism, right? And the image is the happy little market with the happy little independent people innovating and making their own cute little stuff. And then they get paid for it if it's a good idea. And if it's a bad idea, then they go broke, but that's okay because they just go off and innovate something else, right? And it's kind of this nice, like, happy little system.
Or it's, Henry Ford, one man with an idea, and then basically through wit and vigor and a little bit of know-how and risks. You can make yourself a rich person and then pay for workers who like are dependent on you, but it's a good thing. Like it's just these triumphant, like this is the best we can do.
Yeah.
And if you work hard enough and merit it enough, you too can succeed under capitalism. And if you don't, it's because you suck.
Exactly. And there is the invisible hand of the market that is always kind of hovering over everything and making sure that the best people and the best ideas always rise to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not true.
No.
And just like that little image of the family farm isn't the way dairy farming works these days, or that also the other image is not the way the economy actually works.
No, and there's so many things we could tackle here. So this would be a great one if you have questions or thoughts to weigh in on, so we can start engaging.
And
otherwise,
so
we're just going to
focus us.
Yeah. Otherwise, like this is I mean, I could go on 100 different tangents with this, but one place to start is, I think, with most myths. Let me just unpack how I use the word myth usually. It's a story that we generally agree to be true without ever actually making a decision whether or not it's true. It's like this collective narrative that drives our society. And myths become naturalized. We think of them as just how reality is.
Right.
Okay. And so capitalism is largely a set of myths that you don't even like. The idea of private property. This is one of the core bedrocks of capitalism, that an individual can own a piece of land in perpetuity, or a business, that there's an owner to a business, and that they could pass it on to their children in perpetuity, that's somehow natural. Isn't right. It's an arrangement. There's been other way, that's a relatively new one in the history of humanity, but we just take it for granted. So that's why we can justify using police violence to stop someone from taking bread from a store, right?
Yeah. So, for example, we're Micah. We have a retreat center in Northwest Minnesota, and we're just a couple miles down the road from the place where this treaty was signed in the late 1800s that basically quote gave, and when you're giving something at gunpoint, it's always a little hard to say that giving is really involved. But so this treaty was signed where 11.5 million acres, so basically the Dakotas and a lot of what is North Dakota and Northwest Minnesota, was given to the U.S. government by the native tribes of that area. And, so before that moment, that 11.5 million acres was seen as simply the earth, right, by these peoples. And this was open, and the peoples related to the ecology and the buffalo and the prairie and the fish and the birds. And it was just the earth, right? At that moment, 11.5 million acres now became private property. Right? This is just a construct, right? So for, the 3 billion years before that, that place was just the earth. Now, the last 120 years, suddenly it's been private property, right? So this is an abstraction.
Yeah, and increasingly carved up.
Yeah.
So then when it's the government property, that's still some vague sense that it's the commons or something that people can use in generally shared ways with some stipulations. But then when it's carved up.
Right. And so what happened was that land was then immediately given to the railroads, right? And the railroad companies were given a mile either side of the train tracks, just given that land as now their private property. And then increasingly that land became available to be given to settlers, right, as if there were no people there before, right? And so, so all of this is an example of the fact that this myth of capitalism as the merit of individual people that do stuff, well, that's nonsense, right? I mean, all of this property, which then was available to generate other wealth, was given to a certain set of people
Yes.
by force of weapons of the government. And that set of people suddenly had this huge jump on developing economically.
Yeah, and just to kind of say something real quick, and then we got a bunch of comments coming up,
Yeah.
which is great. But so you think about it to this day, like that maybe seems abstract. The question is, who owns what? Like that's really, so we all go to work. Most of us don't own many things. Like we go to a company that's owned by someone else. Many of us live in land owned by someone else. And that's the way it always is. And it's not because of their hard work. It's because they have legal right to that. And so when you start looking at socialism, it starts asking like, well, does it have to be this person owning that? Can't the company be owned collectively by the workers to varying degrees based upon how much they work or what they do maybe, but it's collectively owned? Can't the land be more of a held in common with some small parts of land that can be your personal property rather than private property? And so it asks this question, like, we don't have to do it this way. That's not the way it's always been done. Here's the first question. Can you talk about how money works without capitalism? That's such a big question.
Right. Well, yeah. So the term capitalism, right, comes from the idea of capital, right? And so capitalism started by this notion that people could take their money and pool it together to get stuff done. And so increasingly, money became more important than the thing you were doing. Mm-hmm. Right? And making money from money became increasingly the point of economic activity. Before capitalism, money was simply sort of this convenient, almost kind of like bookmark or placeholder for exchange. So if I had a chicken and you had a goat and we wanted to swap, but there was this idea in the economy that one goat was more valuable than one chicken. So then I could swap you, we could swap, and I could give you a little money, which would indicate that equivalent value. But money was not being used to make money on money, right? That's the new layer that capitalism adds to all of this. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, things like taking care of people, feeding people, all of that become less and less important.
Yeah, and so there are forms of socialism that say, well, of course we'll still have markets because people will want to exchange goods. It's just that we're going to fundamentally change the general sense of ownership and have more democracy in the economic realm. Here's a string of great questions. Here's a few that are kind of related. Thank you for this venue to discuss the connection of capitalism and the pandemic, which we haven't really gotten into yet, but I think we should. But here's also a question. Do we have some good readings or reliable links about the connection between capitalism and the pandemic?
And then actually Lucas throws something up here.
Lucas does. I don't know Lucas super well, but I know this is probably a legit reference, so this is worth checking out. I've been listening to a great podcast lately that is making these connections between climate change and this pandemic, which of course includes capitalism as well. I'll leave that up for a few moments. There's maybe I just need to dig more, but it's not like there's been tons of stuff coming out about the pandemic from a capitalist lens, like in terms of books or anything, but I'm sure the usual news sources like Mother Jones, Jacobin, any of your lefty publications are probably looking at that lens.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the pandemic is so new that there hasn't been a ton of time to do a lot of writing on this, but over time, I'm sure there will be more and more. And again, so one of the most obvious core connections in this regard is that, so as capitalism has evolved and as our society has evolved, what has happened, right, is that, and again, this is where the myth of the free market is a total myth, right? The market is not free. So increasingly, the market is controlled more and more by bigger and bigger entities. Right. And so now if, like, let's say I wanted to start an awesome product delivery business where you could order your product online and somebody would drive it to your house, Amazon would squash me in a second, right? And
Mhm.
so the market is increasingly controlled by these massive companies, and one that contributes to all of the issues and problems of global warming that we're talking about, because it requires endless consumption, endless gobbling of resources. Again, the purpose becomes just to make money. The purpose does not become to care for the planet, to care for people,
Mhm.
to live sustainably. It's all about, making more profit for your owners. Um,
Yes.
and that's one of the things then that leads to the ecological crisis that is causing something like the pandemic.
Yeah, and there's some great comments coming up here. Just right now, the way in which resources are being distributed is determined by a capitalist system. So this is how it really, like Dan is saying it, this is how it relates. So when it seems difficult, like our system isn't set up to help people, it shows the limits of capitalism. Like right now, these rich people are just they're benefiting from it. Here's one of the first a resource here again from Lucas. I think of Naomi Klein and others' work on disaster capitalism. Shock Doctrine. That's a book you might want to look at. As good resources.
We mentioned that a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
And this is the idea that anytime there's a human crisis, that becomes a catalyst for intensification of,
Right.
of capitalist greed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Deborah's got a great comment here. This is we talked about farming. This is a great example about the disaster of capitalism.
A good example is also comparing for-profit private healthcare in the U.S., which is highly based on capitalism and getting people rich from suffering and illness, compared to a national healthcare situation.
Right.
Yeah, what's the bottom line?
Yeah.
What is it that we
right?
Healthcare should serve people. People shouldn't serve healthcare. That's kind of like become my new mantra, and that's what capitalism does: is it subordinates everything
right
to the system, so that we
right.
become commodities.
Yeah, and so now in the pandemic, I mean, you have this absolutely bizarre thing going on with healthcare, right? That healthcare systems are going broke during one of the worst healthcare crises of our lifetime.
Yeah.
Right? If that doesn't show how crazy the system is, I don't know what does. And of course, the reason that's happening is because these healthcare systems are set up to make profits. Even quote non-profit ones are set up to make profits. And so suddenly, all of the owners or the leaders of this, who are making obscene amounts of money, or the idea that nursing homes are publicly traded stock companies is completely obscene, right? But many of them are. And so then they're like, oh my gosh, we can't do elective surgeries. We're going to go broke. We've got to lay off healthcare workers.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go back to a comment that from Kathleen. I've been reading about how Leopold of Belgium, shitty dude, claimed the Congo because he said it was available. Millions died in order for the Western world to have cheap rubber. Like, I don't understand why we don't talk about Leopold more. It's it's because of who he killed.
Yep.
It's different. Like it shows race. This kind of is the racist colonial backstory to capitalism. Mm-hmm. So it's all about this ownership. So if we're upset about distribution of wealth in our society, we need to also step back and look at it globally. Yep. Africa isn't struggling. We always talk about Africa struggling because of it's somehow their own corruption and bad choices. Western powers did this to Africa, right? So we've extracted resources from all over the world, and then when they suffer, we say, it's your own fault. Yeah. This is one of the most insidious narratives of capitalism, is that if you're listening right now and you're struggling, that somehow you're internalizing this message. You're being told that it's somehow your fault. Yeah. It's such a I'm getting upset.
And those of you that are not aware of Leopold of Belgium, and it is a really fascinating study in historical erasure. This is one of the greatest genocides of all time. What the Belgian government did in the Congo, and I don't have time to detail that now, but I would encourage you to look that up and learn about it.
A few more great comments. Thanks for bringing the comments in today.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is it Hadje? Sorry if I'm not doing your name justice, but how about the new book by Slavoj Žižek, Pandemic? I haven't heard anything about it. I have mixed feelings about Slavoj Žižek, but yes. I also know that he's an important thinker and probably has a lot of great things to say. Right. Deborah writes, healthcare workers are getting furloughed during a pandemic. That is only because of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Lucas writes, can you also talk about the push to open up the economy in the midst of the pandemic? What are the forces inherent within capitalism that make opening up such a necessity?
Yes. Yeah. So this is probably the best example of how we see capitalism and the pandemic intersecting, right? Is this push to open up the economy. Because of course, people need to make money, right? And again, this whole notion of, and as Mark said, if you're suffering, it's your fault. I mean, this idea now that's being pushed down onto the workers of, we've got to get working, we've got to get back, who cares if you're going to get sick? Who cares if you're going to die? The whole push to keep these factories open, to keep these plants open. Now we're pressuring Mexico to keep all of the Mexican plants that are bringing stuff to the U.S. open. I mean, all of that is to keep this money-making machine going for the owners and for certain people, right? Mm-hmm. And again, it's not to say, oh, let's completely relook at how we distribute resources and take care of folks. It's, no, we've got to get back to work to make money. Okay, Catherine's comment.
Another myth that the suffering Europeans inflicted on indigenous peoples to profit from colonialism was somehow necessary for progress.
Yes. Right. So capitalism comes along with a triumphant Christianity that basically says we're civilized and you're not. Mm-hmm. And so that, and progress was civilization, and hard to quite understand how killing millions is progress, but that's how the mind can get really twisted around.
Yeah, there's so many, like, part of the whole narrative of conquest, just being justifiable, is, unfortunately, this ties into Christianity, and then religion is the command to go make the earth productive, basically. And so if you come upon people who aren't making it productive, then they're less civilized, and we can take the land from them. That's a huge narrative that we still use to this day. It's our justification for oil conquest. Another comment here from Colin. Many of the abusive practices we complain about are simply our own colonialism come home to roost. It's been really intensifying lately, though.
Yes, so that's a great comment, right? Because, and this is the classic thing that happens with formation and myth making and the process of ego, right? Is that the things that we don't see, and some people have talked about this in terms of like the shadow side, the pain that we push down, whatever it is. The problems that we don't see, we project outward, right? And we then project onto others. And so, capitalism says, all right, in order to make money, and, one example, I gave the vegetable packing plants in Southern California, where when I was a kid, the workers there who were illegal aliens were being paid about 5 cents an hour to work there. And so we're using those people to make profit on canning beans on a mass scale. But then we say, those people are these dirty illegal aliens, right? Mm-hmm. So we project that negativity and that pain of our system onto those people and scapegoat them. And then eventually, of course, as the system creates more and more problems, another great example is trash, right? I mean, the earth is now full of garbage from this capitalist system, because the people that make stuff are not forced to actually pay the cost of the garbage that they produce. Right? And so the negativity, the shadow stuff, eventually just folds back on us. Yeah, and it's May Day. We didn't even mention we're talking about capitalism on May Day. That's a work of sheer genius that we didn't even notice.
I mentioned in one of our posts yesterday.
Okay,
so, but it was after the fact. I didn't realize it until after the fact. When progress really just meant a particular group of people hoarding resources and getting returns on their investment. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is who is the economy for? Yes. It's a question we have to keep asking ourselves. A good question for May Day. A lot of people in my home state of Texas are wanting to open up the economy, are working class folks. How do we talk about these issues in a way that connects them with them and helps them to stop voting against their own, voting against their own self-interest?
Yes.
Man, that's like the $1 trillion question, isn't it?
Well, it is. But it also, and what this shows and highlights is the power of these myths and formations. Right. So again, if, and it's the famous George W. Bush, simple answers to complex problems. I mean, that's the power of these myths. When you buy that thing of butter and you see that pretty little picture of that little farm, it makes you feel good. And you go, wow, this butter comes from a pretty little farm. Isn't that nice? I feel good. My life is happy. Their life is happy. The animal's life is happy. Everything's okay, right? It's this anesthetization. And that's what these myths do. And so you've got a lot of people who, their livelihoods are shot to shit because of this, and they're scared and they're pissed, and I'm totally sympathetic about that, right? And so, but again, if you're just operating on this one track mindset, you just say, well, the solution is just get back to what we were doing before. And one of the things that if you look at liberation theology, right, which was this movement in Central America amongst poor indigenous people, that the core process to the liberation theology movement was a process of demythologizing, right? And so these indigenous workers who largely worked on plantations would actually, after a 12-hour day hacking bananas or whatever, would actually get together in these little groups and read the Bible and reflect upon their situation and realize that they were the oppressed. But it took some work, right? And that's the tough thing, Lucas, about what you're talking about, is that without some work, we cannot undo these myths.
Yeah, and there's just a resource. I don't know if I'm spelling this right. If you want an example of what Dan is talking about, the Gospel in Soul and Taname is Ernesto Cardenal, a Nicaraguan priest, having Bible studies. Like, it's basically these Bible studies recorded. It's like it's a big book with some of the art from the kind of the art colony that they had there. Yeah, and this is the thing. Like, it hasn't always been the case that most working class people in America were pro-capitalism, right? I mean, so this is the thing. Like, in the short term, I don't think working class people should be the ones who suffer in order to get the economy going, right? And so we got to figure out some solutions that aren't just sending people back to work, but like right now working class people are bearing the brunt of this stuff. But in the long term, we need to change our narratives. I mean, appealing to our best values. Like, I often think, most people I grew up with had this sense of neighborliness, hospitality, taking care of each other. That is kind of part of what it means to be human, those things. And I think those can be appealed to. And, maybe in a future episode, we've talked about having one about the problems of liberalism as a mindset to kind of those people that are working class in rural America and then even urban America who think that liberals are kind of elitist and they don't trust them have reasons to think that. And so them being told and we've already talked about this, but Dan mentions this to me a lot, that this narrative of, choosing the health for everybody versus the economy has become this no winners sort of game, where the kind of the liberal establishment, if you want to use that sort of term, is asking people to make sacrifices for the public health, when that doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, so I do think that, one of the things moving forward, right, and we've mentioned, how do we respond to this pandemic? What does this call out of us? How do we start thinking about what we're noticing and what we want to do into the future? I think that all of these issues come to play, right? And we can just look at the fact that the response to the pandemic from economic point of view, right, has suddenly been for the government to give people tons of money, which again, a couple months ago before this hit, these same people would have said was the socialist nightmare. Right. And yet what's interesting, right, is that what we notice is when they're struggling in difficult times, the collective needs to come to the fore, and we need to take care of each other. So we can really begin to think moving forward, all right, how do we want to, in ways big and small, redesign our economic relationships so that they are helpful to humans and not simply about how much money can we make off of this.
Yep. And we're kind of at the end of our time, and we keep talking for forever. But we've just barely pulled out a few strands of this whole thing. And I'm glad people have brought up suggestions for further reading. It's a big task, and it's complicated, but it's because so much of this stuff has been baked into our system, and we're not encouraged to question it.
Right.
And so once you start questioning it, it gets kind of difficult to wrap your head around. But to me, this is where having an imagination of things can be different, and we can start thinking about how it could be different.
Yeah, and there could be like a center for prophetic imagination where we could do that stuff. All right, thanks for all the great comments and questions. See you all on Monday, and next Wednesday too, we've got another guest coming. We're going to talk about reimagining spiritual community after the pandemic. So excited about that.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. All right.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye.